Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Tom Cunningham, the Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center. And on behalf of Ambassador Morningstar, who will be right in, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's panel discussion. At the Global Energy Center, we are devoted to addressing the unprecedented change that is defining the relationship between energy and society. We want to build a global community that is capable of dealing with geopolitical, economic, and environmental issues that arise. Today's topic is UAVs in the energy sector, not drones. And it's about their application and associated regulatory issues. Just a glance at the list of participants in the audience today also demonstrates how much interest this issue garners in terms of the breadth of entities represented, different players in various sectors, technology niches, and policy circles. I think one reason why UAVs are so interesting is that their potential is massive, and exactly how they will integrate into our daily lives, into societal activity, and into the physical world remains uncertain given that potential. And it's also become clear that these UAVs are incredibly useful for a huge number of reasons, a huge number of functions. But what is not clear is what frameworks need to be in place to regulate their activity and how such regulations would predetermine and uplift or possibly undercut their potential. So looking at this question of the potential of UAVs in the context of energy, I think is also particularly insightful because energy itself is so cross-cutting. It's holistic across our society, and it is hard to understand the scope to which UAVs could make a difference and how companies, policymakers, and regulators tackle this question and let the technology flourish while also ensuring adequate safety, security, and privacy. But as you can tell, I'm stuck in the abstract because I obviously have a weak grasp of this issue. So I'll get off the stage and let the experts do their thing. But I do hope today will shed light on what level of benefit UAVs can bring to energy companies, what the regulatory context is, and what are the challenges going forward, including at the domestic and international level. I want to say a special word of thanks to our senior fellow, Cynthia Quarterman. She's the only person that I know of to have run two separate federal regulatory agencies. That's correct, right? Big deal, and we're lucky to have her expertise on energy-related infrastructure issues here at the Council. You may have actually heard her speaking on the Diane Rehm show yesterday. She astutely, she told me not to say that. She astutely saw the domestic and international policy implications of this issue, and she developed this event single-handedly, so thanks a lot. Cynthia will introduce our fellow participants, each of them very distinguished and representing a unique perspective. Thank you all for being here as well. Cynthia will moderate the discussion and field some questions from the audience. I'm eager to hear how the discussion goes. Please note that the event is being streamed live. It's on the record, and you can follow online at AC Energy on Twitter. Thanks a lot. Go for it.
Thanks, Tom, for that introduction. It's a good thing I was on Diane Rehm yesterday, so I'm used to the unexpected here. We have with us today a very distinguished panel of experts on using drones. I know some of our panelists won't like me calling them that, but it's easiest for me, or unmanned aerial vehicles or aircraft systems in the energy space. The Federal Aviation, or FAA, in August issued a final rule on the use of small UASs or UAVs. We're joined here today by Dexter Lewis, to my left. He's a senior engineer and the UAS program lead at Southern Company. Southern has the distinction of being the first electric utility to go in for what is called a Rule 333 exemption, and got it granted in, I think, March of 2015. So they really are on the cutting edge of this issue from an electric utility perspective. Next to Dexter is John O'Brien, who is the Focus Area Manager for Facilities and Operational Reliance at Chevron Energy Technology Company. Chevron also has been doing a great deal with respect to UAVs, not just here in the United States, but around the world, and we're very glad to have him with us today. Last but not least, we have Rob Pappas, the Special Rules Coordinator, Unmanned Aircraft Systems Integration at the Federal Aviation Administration here in the United States. He has really been responsible for figuring out how to deal with this new technology from the government's perspective here in the U.S. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here today and all of us. I want to start with John, and many of us here use the term drone. We either think of a toy or we think of the scene in The Eye in the Sky or Amazon flying packages to us through our neighborhoods. Can you enlighten us a little bit on what you are doing with this technology in the oil and gas industry as of now?
So yes, I avoid the word drones because all the vehicles that we operate currently have a human intervention capability. So they're not drones, and I think that's very important for the public to understand that we're not just letting these things loose. It's evolving technology, but there are a huge amount of applications starting at the environmental spectrum. We started some time ago with monitoring turtle tracking on beaches without disturbing the wildlife itself, to ensure that we understand our impact, or hopefully lack of impact, on the greater environment. Energy loss surveys using infrared, physical inspections, offshore platforms, in refineries, flare towers, places where it's expensive to give access to people, or more importantly for us, where we put people in harm's way by doing it so we can reduce the risk. We've been doing a lot of experimental work around emissions monitoring using unmanned aerial vehicles. We're trying to push the envelope on where's the next rules setting and the gaps that we're currently restricted in, and also looking at the impacts of what happens to our infrastructure if others fly these items into the, so there's a two-way street for us. So there is a huge potential, and of course the other big thing now is we generate a lot of data, so how do we manage the data?
Always. Dexter, you guys are on the bleeding edge. What have you been doing in Southern Company from the perspective of UAV usage?
Sure. Thank you, Cynthia. Our use cases, honestly, are very similar to the use cases that John talks about. As a large electric utility and serving several states, we've got infrastructure that's several thousands of miles long in very rural areas. And to maintain that infrastructure so that it's healthy enough to maintain a good reliability for our customers, it requires frequent inspection. And right now, our most economic method is to use helicopters. Well, there's certain risks with operating a helicopter that close to the wires environment or near vertical infrastructure. And so we have a drive to look at, can we use unmanned aircraft to do that safer and cheaper and honestly do a better inspection. So it's looking at our traditional inspection methods, as well as looking at what are some new opportunities where we've previously never used aerial photography before. One of them that stands out is storm restoration. So after a storm comes through, think tornadoes in the southeast, it's very important to get our power back on as quickly as possible for our customers. Our current process is honestly a boots on the ground process, but we see using unmanned aircraft, we could speed that process up in terms of identifying the damage and the extent of it. So it's those traditional inspection methods where we're looking at, can we just do it better with a drone, an unmanned aircraft, excuse me. These new opportunities that we see that we could do within the existing rule framework of Part 107, and then ultimately, what are these futuristic designs of, can we have an unmanned aircraft that sits in a substation or at a plant and autonomously once a day does an inspection of that infrastructure to make sure that it's healthy. So that's a little bit further down the road, Rob, so we're not doing that today, but we certainly have those on our radar.
Now, Rob, you've seen the waterfront, being the man here in Washington, getting all these requests for exemptions. Are there other uses that you have seen come to you in the energy industry that these gentlemen may not have covered so far?
I think the items that have been covered from an energy sector standpoint kind of cover that waterfront. I think part of the challenge for a regulatory agency such as the FAA relative to a new technology like this, especially one that really has a very low entry cost. So they're fairly low cost to capitalize and start using, but they're almost innumerable applications throughout all kinds of industries. And part of the challenge for the FAA is keeping up with companies like Chevron and Southern and other companies who are really innovating. And it's not just large companies, there's many, many small operators who are just really innovating in so many ways. And it's a real challenge for us, but a good challenge, one that we're really enjoying, is how to get the regulatory framework in place to be able to enable and facilitate these types of operations, and at the same time, try not to be too overly burdensome in the process. So it's quite a challenge.
Well, you mentioned something that I really want to key in on. You say many industries have these issues. Are there things that are unique to the energy industry with respect to the use of UAVs, or will these issues be universal across all companies? What do you gentlemen think?
I'll just start if you don't mind. I think I think the energy industry, is not entirely unique. However, I think it's representative of a grouping of operators that need to, operate over very long distances, operate for the most part. This is not entirely, but for the most part within well-defined corridors of right-of-ways, and those distances are not unique to the electrical industry or the pipelines. As many of you know already, we're working with the railroad industry on a pathfinder with BNSF, which is really looking at beyond visual line of sight. So how do we facilitate those kinds of operations? And that's what we're doing a lot of work with, and we continue to work with other energy industries to see how we can work together to develop equipment, to develop standards and operating procedures that will make these operations safe and effective.
John or Dexter?
I think Rob hit it pretty on the head. The railroad industry is certainly one that's very similar. Mm-hmm. Anytime you've got long vertical infrastructure that you're trying to monitor in defined corridors, so he's right there. One thing that is a little unique is that our message seems to resonate very well with our customers and our state regulators of, look, I know there's a lot of concerns with using unmanned aircraft, but we're trying to use them to keep our infrastructure healthy, which in turn returns immediate value to keeping our customers happy and keeping the lights on. That's same with the railroad. They're looking to make sure that their tracks are in good order to make sure that there's no issues there. I think that's unique, and then also it's unique in the fact that we're operating over such important infrastructure with our trained professionals. We're working with the FAA and say we want to do this, we need to operate this close to this infrastructure, while at the same time we're trying to determine what's the limit, if any, that should be out there with other operators that maybe should not be that close to that infrastructure. And it's a unique position of how do you make that argument of, we have the expertise to do it safely, but the kid who gets one from Christmas shouldn't come within X number of feet from our assets. And then how do you enforce that? It's kind of a difficult issue there.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the advantage we have to some part is that this is an extension of something we already do. We already have aviation operations, whether they be fixed wing or rotary aircraft, and we've had policies, procedures, and experience. So we're moving. It's not a revolution. It's an evolution from the safety bubble environment, and that should give us some extra confidence that we can build upon. I think other industries who have not had that, that's their big challenge of how they understand and fit in and establish their procedures. And the big thing I think is as well is that I got to DC last night and I was walking around, stretching my legs and watching rush hour traffic, and making the comparison of just look at the intersection gridlock that occurs and now we have 2 or 3 million unmanned aircraft vehicles in the airspace. Just like our road system and our traffic control, we are going to have to sit down, and who that is may be debatable, but there are going to have to be certain rules and areas that are no-go areas unless you're the owner or the operator. And I think the public will expect that of the energy industry and the regulatory and rule-making everywhere, that there is some control. That otherwise we're going to get to permanent gridlock again.
Yes. Well, when I think of the energy industries, I think of the spaghetti-like assets that many of you have, whether it be pipelines or utility lines, and I guess railroads are similar in that. Rob, can you tell us more about what you're doing with Pathfinder and how it might be applicable to the energy industry?
Yes, the Pathfinder program is something that Administrator Huerta kicked off about 1.5 years ago, a little more than that. And it was really, we had developed a list of challenge areas relative to UAS integration. And within the FAA, we went through a series of exercises to prioritize those. We're very much in a crawl, walk, run type of evolution with all this. And so for our first Pathfinders, all the Pathfinders were, a challenge in each way. But we tried to pick a number of Pathfinders that weren't like the ultimate challenge. So we picked 3 areas. One that we're working on with CNN is to operate over people. We are working with a company called Precision Hawk on an area of beyond visual line of sight that we refer to as extended visual line of sight, which I won't get into, but that's very important to operators that need to operate over larger areas. Agriculture is one that comes to mind there. Pathfinder 3 was beyond visual line of sight, and we partnered with BNSF to explore that area. It's been a really very productive partnership. BNSF has done a tremendous amount of work, and the main areas that we're exploring that are really, the areas that apply to the energy sector as well is, you need to have an effective command and control system over these long distances. You have to maintain that positive control over your aircraft. You need to, what I call station keep, but you need to have some navigational performance. You want to stay in your corridor or near it, within some limit. And the other challenge really is we are integrating into existing airspace. That existing airspace is open to many different types of aviation participants. And so the area surveillance is really proving to be one of the areas that's a real challenge. And many different industries right now, and the UAS test sites that we have, the 7 test sites we have across the country, are looking at both ground-based solutions to conducting surveillance of the airspace along these routes, along this infrastructure, as well as looking at new technologies that are emerging relative to airborne surveillance. So some type of system that would be on the UAS itself to surveil that airspace. One of the really interesting things with these networks is that risk varies as you travel and transit through these networks. At one point, the risk may be very, very low. At another point, maybe a terminus point, the risk gets relatively high. Trying to figure out what are the appropriate mitigations as you transit through these systems, that's something we're looking very carefully at.
Well, when I think about pipelines, having just recently run the pipeline safety program, I think about all that right away that gets flown by either a fixed aircraft or by helicopters for inspection on an annual basis. And it seems like a great opportunity to really improve actually the oversight of that. Are the companies thinking about that? How far along are we on that use of the UAVs and UASs?
So it's a prime target. It's exactly what we need to do, and it's going to add great value and offer to the wider stakeholders an improvement in our performance and the national infrastructure. And there's at least one gentleman in the audience right now who knows we're working on a joint industry initiative with one of the test areas, and the prime aim of that work is to be able to demonstrate to people like the FAA and other international regulators that beyond line of sight, we've tried, we've tested, we've understood. And we also know that simultaneous operations is something we encounter a lot in our industry, both on the pipeline network and offshore. So the physical protection of the space around us and the interaction where our pipelines cross an electrical line or a railroad to make sure that we're not all flying unmanned aerial vehicles into each other is something that we're going to have to prove, and also the other aviation operators in the space. But I mean, the first one is just the ability to respond immediately to an emergency instead of our past where sometimes people have rushed in, the emergency services have rushed in, and we put people at risk. The idea that we could launch a UAV, we could get data, and we could direct ground people more effectively before they put themselves in harm's way, you know, would be great. And because we don't know where those incidents are going to occur, beyond line of sight becomes a great advantage. But just the regular get out of the helicopters, get out of the fixed wing. We would be able to do these more frequently. We would be able potentially to do them at lower altitude, fly different mission packages and sensors. So yeah, I mean, we're very committed as an industry, I think, to trying to push the envelope there, but clearly recognize that we have to demonstrate that we can do it robustly, reliably, and safely.
What about the electric utility industry, Dexter? Are you doing a similar sort of pilot project on transmission lines, or?
Sure. Yeah. So since our 333 in March of 15, we've done over 1,000 flights looking at business cases all throughout our business units. Primarily, though, focusing on transmission because, again, that is a kind of one-to-one comparison of aerial inspections. We have cost per miles per hour of our traditional method, be it helicopters. And we have done extensive analysis and using an unmanned aircraft and kind of a lineman crew with a UAS capability. And I'll say that this final rule that came out on August 27 makes that a lot easier because we previously didn't have a bunch of linemen that were pilots, but it's a lot easier to have them become a remote pilot, get their certificate. So I think we're close. We're not there. I would say in 2017, though, we've got some specific R&D that's going to make it a lot closer, and I think we can get there in terms of replacing our helicopter inspections for routine work. To John's point, anything that's emergency driven usually has a tight timeline associated with it, and you're probably going to need those beyond line of sight operations to make that feasible.
Now, just to close out uses, you're talking a little bit about things in R&D, and I don't want to touch any trade secret issues, but what are some of the pie in the sky thinking for uses of these drones beyond what you're doing right now?
So, well, I don't necessarily consider it pie in the sky. I mean, we're working pretty hard on this and hope to have a solution next year. But if you look at the commercially available aircraft that are, you know, $1,000, $500, they're pretty capable aircraft where they will pretty much fly themselves. And again, you do have the remote pilot there serving as emergency situations. But you could hit a button and have an aircraft do a complete inspection of a transmission tower. So I foresee that if we can have that set up so that if you pull up to a tower to do an inspection as a lineman, you don't have to necessarily have the skill set to be able to do a very comprehensive inspection. You just have to be able to hit a button as well as have your remote pilot certificate to make any emergency responses should an aircraft come in your airspace. But that's doable, and that's doable with available technology today. It's just a coding and a software project. So that's where we're focusing next year.
Yeah, I think we're probably in the same place. I tend to talk about, you know, operating unmanned area vehicles now as two items. The actual vehicle side, there's a huge industry out there. The military spent a ton of money, the major aviation people. The vehicles are pretty much available for a lot of our applications. The areas we're doing R&D is procedures and practice, and then what I tend to call the mission package. What do you want to get out of the flight? So that's the sensors, whether it be cameras, infrared, methane mapping, CO2 mapping, anything you want. So the growth for us is a lot around the mission package. And then what do you do with the data? Because flying the unmanned aerial vehicle and gaining the data gives me absolutely nothing at all. It's the decisions I make based on the data that are important and how it improves what we do. And as we generate more data, we need different systems, algorithms, pattern recognition, digital image correlation to go through those thousands of images or hours of video footage, because humans are just going to get bored and they're going to miss stuff. So that for me is the growth area that we're working on and targeting. And for the bigger operators, that's where we see it. For smaller companies, that's what they're going to look to the industry to do as well. Don't just give me a video image. I actually need something I make a decision on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Rob, anything you can share with us that you've heard about that might be of interest?
No, I think they've summed it up pretty well relative to pie in the sky. Of course, the FAA has its own pie in the sky, and that's to be able to, to again facilitate these types of operations. So, when we, contemplate the aircraft, sure, the technology is there. These aircraft are quite remarkable in their capabilities, but as we dive into these areas of greater complexity, especially beyond visual line of sight, we are talking many hundreds of miles per operation in these cases. The relative safety hazard expands. So when we talk about these aircraft, we really need to be thinking about, what are the airworthiness standards? Many of those don't exist today. And so that's one of our pie in the sky needs that we continue to talk with the community about is getting those standards in place, looking at other operational requirements that will be necessary relative to these types of operations, and just safely integrating these into an existing airspace with all those users. So there's a lot of moving parts that go here. And that have to be coordinated, and so that's the pie in the sky that we're working on.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the second thing I wanted to ask about, which are, what are the challenges to this new technology? I'm sure there must be safety, privacy, and national security. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing and you're facing as you try to implement this?
So there is a wide range of them. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do wide infrastructure and you're flying over the public, there's an inherent sort of stakeholder engagement with the wider of what are you taking of me and what are you using it for and why. So that comes in. As you fly low-level missions over things like refineries and chemical plants, a new one comes in for the vehicle manufacturer space of the vehicle itself might actually be an ignition source in a hydrocarbon release situation. So a lot of people now, we're starting to say in those areas, we're now looking for vehicles that are certified in compliance with hazardous area certification, which is very limited currently around the world. So low-level flights around and in infrastructure, such as hydrocarbon processing plants, will provide a different challenge. When we move offshore, it's a different space again. Of course, we're in a more controlled environment away from the public, but we have weather conditions and so on. And again, long distances from potential launch sites and recovery sites. So I believe there are a lot of challenges, and we need to be open and transparent. A lot of the data is currently being recorded, but it's probably being recorded from a higher altitude and with fixed platforms. So maybe people aren't aware that it's there. But yeah, if you're going to be flying over neighborhoods and so on, people are going to be concerned about who's doing what. It's just natural that there's an inquisitiveness, and I think there's going to need to be outreach and understanding with the community partners.
Dexter?
Yeah, no, I think John hit most of them. On a simpler response, it's just we get very excited in the technology and caught up in the can you use an unmanned aircraft, and sometimes we forget to ask, should you use an unmanned aircraft? We have traditional inspection processes that we've been using for the last century to maintain our infrastructure, and if binoculars from the ground work well and are the cheapest, safest, fastest solution, just because you could fly an unmanned aircraft, you shouldn't do it. And so it's finding those, really the characteristics of the applications that return value, again, in either cost, efficiency, or safety, and communicating that to our large employee bases as they start integrating this technology so that they do it properly.
Rob, I mean, the FAA is responsible for the civil aviation, the national airspace, including promoting safety. I mean, some of the issues that arise here, are they really within FAA's bailiwick? Or are there other federal agencies or other agencies out there that have a role to play in this, and are they playing that role?
Yes, there are many agencies that have a role to play, and I think one of the areas that has really risen, especially through our last reauthorization of 2016, Section 2209, where that legislation has asked the Department of Transportation and the FAA to look at critical infrastructure throughout our country and what steps may be necessary to be able to control the use of unmanned aircraft near or over those types of facilities. So that's one area that there are many agencies that play a role in that. Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, FBI, other law enforcement agencies, not just at the national level, but also at the state and local levels. So that's one area. Even within these types of operations supporting the energy sector, we're working very closely with the Department of Defense, because when you get into these very long stretches of infrastructure, they transit through restricted operating areas that the military controls. So even in our work with BNSF, we are negotiating, deconflicting, whatever you want to call it, with some of the local military facilities in the New Mexico area that they have rail tracks that transit through. And as we contemplate these operations really expanding nationwide, that will be something that needs to be looked at that national type of level. How do you make that a routine type of process? So I mean, that's a couple of examples. We're also working, not so much related to this, but in some ways, some of your facilities transit very close to airports. And so we've also been asked through legislation, Section 2206, to look at airport security, surveillance, what types of technologies are there to do effective surveillance for UAS. And so we're working with many of the agencies to really look at that and coordinate that. Gets into privacy issues. And, for me, something that, is a real challenge is when they start talking about countermeasures. What countermeasures are, I kind of look at the FAA as kind of a doctor, the Hippocratic Oath, right? We're there to save lives and do no harm. And I think in terms of aviation, the idea of implementing a countermeasure to bring an aircraft down in some way is a difficult thing to think about. So certainly we're also working with law enforcement agencies and others to kind of sort through, when it comes to the countermeasures part, how do we deal with that? That's not a simple
John or Dexter, have you had any interaction with any other federal agencies other than the FAA to deal with some of these national securities or critical infrastructure issues?
Some at the state level. You've seen some state level legislation come up with protecting or having what you can and can't use an unmanned aircraft for, and trying to really, I mean, they mean well. And we usually have some critical infrastructure language in there, but it kind of gets honestly difficult when it's a federal asset and a state legislation trying to regulate operations over it, and private property isn't well defined. So more at the state level though. And then the NATF with their privacy, accountability, and transparency proposed, well, I guess not law, but just recommendations. We supported that.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's been a lot of, I think, interaction with those who've obviously been concerned about privacy. Other agencies, in offshore, it has been a dialogue with a number of agencies, because, you know, if your platform's in the 12-mile limit, who governs? If it's outside the 12-mile limit, then, you know, so Coast Guard and Department of Homeland Security have a role to play, and so on. And you know, all of those, I think, have to be worked out, and they're going to come up because each application sometimes has a unique foible that you have to work around, and an onshore pipeline and something that's 200 miles in the Gulf of Mexico obviously have a completely different paradigm as to the risk level, and also who controls. And is it now airspace, or in some cases, you know, with deep water platforms, you know, Department of Homeland Security controls who goes out there. So, you know, you end up working with multiple regulatory bodies and trying to drive alignment. But that's not unique to unmanned aircraft systems. We've worked that for many years on many particular items and issues. So, but I think it's great for the dialogue to be going on, and for the federal and the state agencies to maybe be coming together to try and provide a one-stop conversation place, if that was ever possible.
Now, Rob, you finished your 107 small UAS rulemaking. Are you done, or is there a lot more coming? I mean, I hear discussion of the beyond line of sight issues. Are there other issues that are hanging out there that are going to continue on with additional rules or exemptions, or what do you think?
Right. So clearly, we're far from done. We have very innovative people that keep prodding us and remind us that we're far from done. And I think even within Part 107, you know, the fact that there were so many waiverable provisions within Part 107 was sort of a preview of already what the FAA was contemplating and thinking about. So we've had a rulemaking team that has been looking at operations over people, and we are hopeful that before the end of this calendar year, so within not too many weeks now, that there will be a notice of proposed rulemaking that will be issued for operations over people. Within the FAA, we are also exploring some of the other waiverable provisions of Part 107 and looking at them from the perspective of how can we make them just a regular part of a regulation, so that proponent would not have to come in and seek a waiver. One of the things that we've learned over the years through certificates of authorization relative to airspace, through the Section 333 mechanism for obtaining regulatory exemptions. Paperwork is really hard. It's, you know, even when it's easy, it's hard. It takes time. It's very costly for the proponent to, you know, file all this paperwork, and it's very, very costly for the FAA to have to go through all this and do the assessments, do these safety assessments, in terms of exemptions, go through quite rigorous assessments before making a decision to grant relief to regulations on the COAs relative to certificates of authorization for airspace. Other than Class G, flying under Part 107 today, to fly in any kind of controlled airspace, you need to apply for an authorization. We're getting quite a few of those, and again, they're very costly. So in addition to just working regulations to make these and recognize these as more routine and provide the basis and framework for making them routine, we also work on tools. So we've had an application out for several years now, Know Before You Fly, which is really aimed at small UAS and even hobby and recreation type operations where you can just turn your iPhone on and it'll see where you are, it'll look things up, and it'll basically give you a green, yellow, red type of indication about operating in that area. So we're also looking at tools that'll make it easier for operators to get airspace authorizations. So we're looking at tools that would, I don't want to say fully automate it, but make it much more electronic and make it more of just a quick transaction with the FAA. So no, we're far from being done. There's a lot of work to do. I think 107 in many ways picked some low-hanging fruit, and I think it was right on in what it was doing because it's enabled just a tremendous amount of operations. But now we're at the point of rolling up our shirt sleeves and sharpening our pencils and working with really smart people in the private sector to really figure out how to do these more challenging operations.
John and Dexter, did you miss anything you'd like to see done for the energy industries?
No, I mean, I think the way your question was tailored, I go back to the crawl, walk, run. You know, the 333 process allowed us to get out there and start crawling, but it certainly had its limitations that we didn't like. But I applaud you in 107. You did a really good job. And so, you know, I understand that next hurdle of beyond 107, besides just the waiverable things, you know, the beyond line of sight, the autonomous, that's a big challenge. It's not easy to solve. And so we look forward to the collaboration to help support it.
As a former regulator, let me say that's high praise coming from in industry. Congratulations on that.
I'll just add to that. So Section 333 was a really awesome, kind of laboratory, and I was really, I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to lead that project. And it was a laboratory, so we did a lot of experimenting, and a lot of what we did in 333 was really informing really what evolved into 107. But, you know, as 107 was evolving, you can't reach too far, within Section 333 when you have a rule that may go out for public comment and come back with a lot of, you guys are crazy, we're opposed to this, and then we got to ratchet back when we've already perhaps approved something through a grant of exemption. So the 333s, although I think they were quite liberal in some ways, I can understand from an operator perspective that in other ways they were probably looked at as being quite restrictive. So, but we got there together.
Fair enough.
So.
John, you have anything to add?
I think we've got to be fair all round. This technology is moving at such a pace. I mean, I get endless calls and emails and a week. The FAA must get it by a much greater volume, and it's hard to keep track. And we've dealt with other regulators in other parts of the world, and there hasn't been a lot of difference, I think, in the approach, particularly amongst those nations that have a very advanced airspace control system. In some countries, they're still not even going to talk about us as industries using the technology. So, of course, we never get everything we want, but I think we've progressed fairly well in North America, and yeah, we'll still be pushing them on the envelope. They know that, but the one thing we have to ensure is the biggest problem. You can kill a technology by a real early mishap. Number of technologies I've seen over the years, and people still today tell me, oh, 20 years ago we tried that and it didn't work. Well, it's still the death knell for the technology 20 years later, because those people haven't retired or moved on. And the fact that, 20 years has gone by and the technology's changed is a barrier. So the last thing we want is to move so fast that we have a major issue that, brings the portcullis down, well, we're not going to allow any use of them because of this one incident, and we spend another 10 years trying to draw back from that. So, yeah, there's frustration about pace and regulation, and that there's always going to be from people. But I think we have to balance that by, we can also make a big mistake and then delay it even further. So, I'm not so sure that we could have done that much better than we've done so far.
John, you
Got
mentioned
2 good ones. That's you may have to market them and keep them.
John, you mentioned some other countries. What are some of the other countries doing with respect to regulating UAVs, and is there something we can learn from them in the United States? And maybe Rob, you can address that as well.
So I think there has been international collaboration. There's been sharing amongst the global aviation authorities and so on. We've worked with the United Kingdom CAA. They've been a little bit nimbler than the FAA, but then again, I come from there and it's a smaller country. But not a lot of difference in terms of the expectations and the rules. France seemed to get very liberal very quickly about approving who could fly UESs and so on. Australia has taken a very pragmatic approach, very similar to the UK and the USA. There are other countries that we've already had discussions with, and just concern from security services and military is virtually shutting down the concept of commercial use. So they're really hard to roll back with. But in principle, and I think one of your colleagues said this morning, they'd just seen the EU rulemaking that I think came out today. That I was there a couple of weeks ago discussing. That's taken them time. They despite they want to be one union, all the countries went off and did a bit differently themselves, and some people were calling their colleagues in other countries of, so what do you allow? Oh, well, maybe we'll adopt that, or I don't like that. So it's taken the EU as well time to come out, and knowing the EU, there's probably like a 3 year before they're even applicable in waiting period or whatever type thing. So everybody's working it, but technology is moving fast.
Yes.
So I have to admit, international, I have my hands full just dealing with domestic issues with U.S. integration. So international is not an area that I have any, particular expertise in. What I would say is that the U.S. Integration Office at the FAA, we have a separate division, an international division. It's being led by Tricia Stacy, who was one of our liaisons over in Brussels and came back to the U.S. sometime last year, and she's now heading up that area. What I can say is we're very engaged with ICAO. We're very engaged with JARIS, which is an international rulemaking body, and quite interested in harmonization and keeping things together. I think when you think about UAS, there are many manufacturers of these types of technologies, a lot of subcomponents that get manufactured and designed all over the world. And I think to some degree, there are efficiencies that could be obtained by ensuring that our standards, our requirements, do harmonize to a degree that some of these technologies are interoperable, throughout the world. So.
Well, I understand that the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, is in the midst of beginning to put together rules for, or recommended practices, I think they call them, for UAVs, UASs, except they call them something entirely differently there. So they're the very first stages, and I'm wondering if any of the energy industry folks were involved in that, since they don't usually, have an involvement in the ICAO mechanism. If you've started to think about what happens there, because history can tell us that ICAO adopts recommended practices that pretty much all the countries then harmonize across, and there may be distinct issues that relate to the energy industry that come up there, and you may not know about it. I mean, if you don't have representation, are you aware of that? Are you involved at all?
I am not. I'll defer to John.
Yeah. To be quite honest, I'm not so certain we are. Directly as energy operators, I have seen and had conversations with some consulting groups who are engaged at that level. So I may be wrong. There's bound to be somebody out there in our industry that knows more than me. But it's probably, you might find that some of our aviation groups may have engaged at some level. I'm not aware of it. I do know of a major US-based consultant that we talk to a lot who has been engaged at that level, and certainly from my perspective, that's probably where I'm getting my information and input at the moment. But it's probably not something that we've strategized and made a conscious effort. But maybe somebody out there watching the YouTube will write to me and tell me, no, you're wrong, and I'll get an email and a contact so I can be better informed.
And Cynthia, we've talked about a number of, so we talked about UAS, UAV, drones, and I believe in the ICAO lexicon, it's RPAS, remotely piloted aircraft systems. So.
Right. I know it's something with an R. Yes.
So I guess we're maybe a bit away from full harmonization because we haven't even gotten a single acronym down yet.
I'm waiting for unmanned flying objects.
That's good.
There's a new one just launched.
I know for government, it's often very hard to keep pace with the new technologies, and you've probably been given a lot of new things to add to your plate, and not necessarily having funding associated with that, which means that you either have to change resources from one thing to another or slow down, or what can this industry do to help make things happen more quickly for themselves and for you along the way?
So I'll go back a little bit. So you're absolutely right. And I think the FAA is hardly unique in the regulatory world. The pace of technology is just, it's remarkable how quickly in so many different areas technology is advancing. So for regulatory agencies and for an aviation agency where innovation or technological improvements were more of a step function with many years in between, and our regulatory process was able to kind of keep pace with that. Now we're just seeing just a whole new world where the innovation's happening very, very quickly, and the costs are cheap, very cheap, so everybody wants to play. But even in the traditional world of manned aircraft, there were many devices that were being developed that could really offer a safety improvement for manned airplanes. And we had to find a way to make this technology more available. And so in light sport aircraft, experimental, those users were able to put that equipment on their aircraft. But when we talked about a certified airplane, like a Part 23 airplane, like a Cessna, let's say, because it wasn't an approved device, they couldn't just, an operator of that type of aircraft couldn't just put like an angle of attack indicator, which could really be, which is a big safety mitigator, onto their aircraft. So we've really been going more to performance-based regulations. And we're certainly, looking towards that relative to our UAS rulemaking, and 107 is a reflection of that. I think another area where the industry could really help is standards. So eventually, there will be aircraft that need to meet certain airworthiness requirements, and whether that's a full type certificate that we currently issue to the types of planes that a lot of you probably flew here on, or it's some other kind of airworthiness certificate or a permit to fly or whatever the mechanism may eventually wind up being. For various risk levels, and as we climb up that relative risk curve, there'll have to be some kind of approval, some kind of review. And the existence of standards is very, very helpful because it provides a mechanism that an agency, a regulatory agency such as the FAA, can call out and recognize. The administrator can find that acceptable, and that can certainly make it much, much easier for us to be able to deal with that. Throughput, as I talked before with exemptions, paperwork really clogs up a lot of systems. So having the industry get together and put their heads together and sometimes put their competitive natures aside and sit down around the table and agree to a standard that kind of works for everybody could be very, very helpful.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open it up to the room for any questions you might have of these gentlemen.
Cynthia, this question goes to you. As a former regulator in the energy industry, do you see these devices as a possible tool for federal agencies to use to augment their inspection and enforcement activities?
Well, certainly there's the opportunity there. As in either of these industries, for example, I'm thinking in the offshore, where there are thousands of platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, many of which are unmanned, and it's difficult for the government personnel to go out themselves. They have to pay for and hire a helicopter to go to those facilities. There may be opportunities for them to do the same sorts of inspections using a UAV as well as what the companies themselves are doing. So yes, I do see opportunities there. They will probably be behind what everybody else is doing, but yes, there are opportunities, I think.
Good morning. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. My name is James Bradbury. I work at the EU delegation as Transport and Energy Councillor. And I see that Bill Schuster has been selected again to run to chair the Transport and Infrastructure Committee in the House. And we know that he pushes an agenda of FAA reform, citing it would be good for safe, efficient, and modern operation of the air transport system. With that in mind, I just wondered what the panel's views would be on how that discussion may affect the regulation and the operation of UAVs, as we know that the reauthorization is coming up next year, so there'll be negotiations on the Hill.
That's a great question. I would answer it just by saying, we know that there are use cases out there that really indicate that there will be an increasing role, an increasing presence of unmanned aircraft systems in all kinds of environments. And we've kind of gotten over those first crawling stages and picking the low-hanging fruit. So these operations will more and more start entering more complex environments and certainly more hazardous environments relative to people and property on the ground, as well as airspace. So the FAA is already taking steps with other agencies such as NASA, with our test sites, with our Center of Excellence ashore, it's commonly referred to as UTM, UAS Traffic Management Systems. So there's much work going on at looking at what is UTM, what are all the components of a UTM system, how do we interface a UAS traffic management system with our other traffic management systems that we have operating today. How does a traffic management system for UAS, how do we establish it? So there are a lot of very fundamental questions. There's questions of, do we need to delegate certain authorities or not? Can we delegate certain authorities or not? So it's a very complex area. There's a lot of work going on in it. It's part technological, it's part policy. And I think over the coming years, I can't predict what Congress or the new administration will, push us in one way or another. But, we recognize that it's an area that has to be addressed regardless, because the private sector is pushing to have that access.
Just for the other panelists who may not be aware, Congressman Schuster has been advocating the privatization of the air traffic control system.
I don't know that I have the expertise to answer your question. I apologize.
No, I don't think I do either. It's we tend to give our input through our industry organisations, to governments everywhere. We set out what we would like to do and our desires, and we respond to the frameworks that we're given. is probably as far as I would go.
Very much appreciated. Just a comment, if I may, in reaction to something that John O'Brien said a little bit earlier, with regard to what's going on in the EU. This week, actually, transport ministers met to make a number of decisions on regulating drones. So I invite you to go to the readout on that when you get back to your offices.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. How does the physical capability of the UAV come into these situations of being able to move in a certain way and respond to its signals?
Do you want to go first, or?
I think I understand the question. We found that because the UAS is a smaller physical footprint than a helicopter, you can definitely do a better inspection. And because it's obviously a lot lighter and is not filled with a liquid hydrocarbon fuel, the risk of a failure is much less. So the smaller the better. I mean, honestly, I would imagine that probably 80% of our use cases in 2017 at least can be done with aircraft that weigh less than 10 pounds. I know that the rule will allow us to go up to 55 pounds, but if we're just doing visual inspections, usually the smaller the better.
Now, your industry is also looking at actually doing some repairs and movements as well?
Yeah, so we've in an R&D kind of demo phase, we've contemplated some tethering operations where, to get specific, for running conductor through transmission structures, you usually put a guide wire in there first, and that's done with a helicopter. We've seen video of it being done with an unmanned aircraft, and while it might not be a one-to-one solution, but there are certain areas like over lakes or over large valleys where maybe that UAS would be a better solution.
So yeah, I think it gets back to, I mentioned earlier, the mission package. What do you want to actually do? So the flight range, assuming some point in the future we get to a position with non-line of sight operations, but then physically what you want to hang off the device. And a large part of what we want to do today, as Dexter said, is available on the platforms available in the market. But I think there are technologies that certainly we've been looking at, and some of our peers, that currently the mission package is extremely large and heavy. So, if it proves out that that's a real advantage, then we might want to use a vehicle that is heavier or slower, so things will come around about what you want to actually extract from the flight that you operate. The other thing is, as we become more sophisticated, we may want to do less flights with more sensors on, and that may increase the mission package complexity because we want to do multiple tasks at the same time. The same will come about of whether you can wait for the data or whether you want to move into a real-time transmission of data, and how you communicate with ground stations, and then maybe that we will have to put something on the packages to actually provide the confidence that the flight is safe beyond line of sight. So, but there's such a range of vehicles out there today, as I'm sure the FAA know, that but it is the degree of control. But the smaller packages now have an incredible degree of control and accuracy.
I'm sorry, but just to add on to that, I mean, I think from an FAA standpoint, our interest is less in what kind of packages they need to carry and what their missions are, from a business standpoint, but our function is the safety function. One of the things that we are, working with UAS today that's a little bit different than, the type certificated aircraft that people fly in, is, we very much look at the operation, the mission. Where is it taking place? And we use that as part of the framework of mitigations. So we definitely are looking at, all these different types of operations, within, that mission, and ensuring that these aircraft, the operation of the aircraft, that they're all done in a way that when you add up all those mitigations, it's sufficient to address any safety hazards that have been identified.
Any question?
Thank you. Suzanne Lemieux with API. I just had a question probably for Rob. I know that the FAA is in a pretty significant effort to modernize the air traffic control system. Can you at just a high level say how the progress is going, and would the UTM be concurrent as that moves forward, or would you have to complete one to move to the next?
Yeah, that's a good question. I work in aviation safety. I don't work in air traffic, so I'm very sorry. As you know, there's just quite a bit of work going on to next gen, and all kinds of new capabilities are being implemented. UTM, we are really at the early stages. I think at this point, if you asked 10 people what UTM is, you'd certainly get 10 different answers. And I'm not so sure from my perspective that 10 different answers is necessarily a bad thing. Because again, I think there's all kinds of environments, and a UTM system that might be perfectly suitable for one environment may be overkill in another, and vice versa. So I think you will be seeing much more from the FAA and NASA and the industry relative to UTM developments. And I think, over the coming years, that'll start to bring some clarity. So I'm sorry I couldn't fully answer that.
Good morning. Mark Piazza with Colonial Pipeline. We are an operator of the energy transmission systems that we would like to apply some of these tools, much like Dexter on the electric side. Just a quick question, and mostly for you, Rob. I'm just wondering, we have a lot of, you hit the issue earlier of trying to integrate these UAS platforms in military, restricted airspace and around airports and things like that. I think we've come to the conclusion, and in some respects would agree, that it's not the right tool. I think we talked about that earlier too. It's not the right tool in all cases. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if the FAA would perhaps consider a more open rural space, open airspace, where there are less concerns even from maybe the public, if those would be the opportunities to perhaps, maybe that's where we crawl. I think we've walked. We've done a lot of work under 333s and other 107, at least initially. So maybe those are the opportunities where we could work on technology, the integration of the remote sensing and the platforms, which are really, as John said, the mission objective. What are you after? And I think the topic came up earlier too about what's the pie in the sky. I think through applying these technologies and continuing to gather information, I think there's a lot of smart people. We're going to get really innovative, and we will start to push the envelope a lot farther than where we currently sit as far as how we can really apply these effectively. I'm just wondering if you could comment on whether is that an opportunity for the industry? Thanks.
Yes. And I think our Pathfinder 3 program with BNSF is really What we're learning from that is informed. We have a team, it's called our Expanded Ops team, and they are looking at a number of different types of operations that go beyond Part 107, and beyond visual line of sight is primarily that. We consider the work we're doing with BNSF to definitely be crawling. I think we're kind of at a fast crawl. We're learning a tremendous amount. Just a little bit more than a year ago, we did our first beyond visual line of sight operations in the lower 48, and that was in New Mexico over a BNSF subdivision. It's called the Clovis subdivision, quite rural. And we're learning a lot from that. We are looking at, you know, like I said before, command and control. We're looking at surveillance systems. We're looking at navigational performance. We are simulating and actually having manned aircraft that we're operating as part of our testing, you know, fly through these areas to evaluate the different types of surveillance systems that we are trying out. There's a number of our test sites, New York, North Dakota, to name two. Virginia Tech, the Mid-Atlantic states is working with a power company in Virginia. So there's a lot of folks looking at all the different foundational, you know, elements that are needed to make this happen. So
Seems like that's a good way to get people to understand that we can do this effectively.
yeah, it's a great thing, and I think, you know, one of the things that that we get challenged by is there are so many great companies out there and so many smart people. One of the challenges for us is we have limited bandwidth. You know, there's only so many pathfinders we can do, other special projects we can do. So one of the things we really try to encourage is trade associations to kind of, you know, corral their industry. So within the electrical industry, there's Edison Electric Institute, there's EPRI. We like to see, you know, certain industries get behind one of those associations so that it's a little bit easier to just corral us together and, you know, kind of herd the cats in a good way, I mean, so.
Tom, Atlantic Council, great discussion. My question is for all of you, what's the role of the public in this conversation? So there is a great dialogue between industry and regulators going on. Much of the work that you're doing is in, whether it's oil and gas or power, is really in the upstream and midstream, not consumer facing, right? So there's a big public interest, say, in a drone or a UFO, which is even better, bringing a package to your doorstep. But is there a value in bringing in the public debate or bringing the public into this debate? I think about what the Atlantic Council's potential for participating in such a dialogue moving forward. Is there a value in terms of helping to articulate the need of industry to have new infrastructure, right? So new infrastructure like the Dakota Access Pipeline, it's huge in public debate. It's not just about NIMBY now, it's about all sorts of other ideological issues. Can this be used to move forward in that regard? Can it be used for improving the understanding by the public about the role of regulatory agencies, right? We do have a new political environment coming that talks about scaling back regulation in every way. And then also, is there a value in explaining how innovation is changing rapidly? We think about the innovation of technology in the energy sector, really in terms of, say, new kinds of electric services or new kinds of generation technologies or new kinds of technology for, say, hydraulic fracturing or deep or Arctic drilling. But this is a different way that innovation is playing a big role. How do we make sure public interest is there, and how are you working in that, and what are your views about how it could be done better?
I think there's there's two opportunities we've kind of explored, or that come to mind at least, is first communicating our message of what we're wanting to use unmanned aircraft for. You know, everybody does pick on Amazon for their pie in the sky idea, and we try to make clear that, you know, that's not really our use case today, and not really our pie in the sky idea. And luckily, I believe that message has resonated fairly well. But to something that was mentioned earlier by John, something that I think is really important is, John mentioned if we have an incident, everybody's going to get rolled back and this technology is going to come to a screeching halt. And I don't really foresee, that, I mean, it could, but if you look at the requirements that are put in place for commercial operators, those are above and beyond what is out there for hobbyists and public users. And so I think if we could somehow engage our public to take a responsibility and really embrace, and there are recommendations and rules out there for hobbyist users, but I think I wouldn't want something to happen in that space that affects this potential value that we can unlock in the commercial space. So any type of education and outreach there, and the FAA does do that, is really important.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. It's about informing the public and also listening to their concerns. That a lot of people will read articles and will have a concern, maybe because the article's not complete or it doesn't designate that there are different use cases. So I think there is a big opportunity here. And I said it earlier, I see a lot of this potential with the easy access to small, almost being like traffic management and learning to be responsible in your greater public awareness in the space you share. And the idea that those who want to buy small for recreational or other uses understand that there are lots of places to fly safely, but there are a lot of places maybe you should stay away from. And make sure that we understand this coexistence with the airspace, horizontally, vertically, or whatever it ends up being designated, so that we move the technology forward safely and widely for all concerned. And that is where there probably is still, because there is so much out there right now, even though for those of us who are involved at an in-depth level with these devices, keeping up is a nightmare at times, because it's daily, it's hourly sometimes, that there's a new company, a new R&D, a change in regulation, a discussion. For the public, that's got to be a nightmare. And they have to rely on certain sources of information. So there probably is a role about, a message and a source to go to for, if you really want to know what the pipeline industry is doing with them, or the power utility industry, or the railroad, you can go here and you can get the facts and so on. And so that's probably where I am.
I think from my perspective at the FAA, we are engaged. So, public outreach is just so super critical. And we're really engaged at, a lot of different levels. So, we work with the industry relative to packaging. We don't have requirements or regulations that require anybody to put, certain things into their packages, but certainly we want to encourage people that are buying these at the various stores. It's great when a company like DJI or somebody else puts a little thing in the package that just says, remember, you should register your aircraft, all this other type of stuff. That's great. We do videos, and we have a lot of online materials. And certainly with the, Part 107 and the remote pilot requirements and the testing requirements, that's another way to, engage new aviators, because they are aviators at this point, to get educated and to learn at least the basics. We have our rulemaking process, so the public can, and it's not just the FAA, but across the government can certainly play within that rulemaking process, whether it's requesting a new kind of rule, or whether it's submitting public comments to an NPRM or something like that. That's another avenue for communication. But two of the newest things that we're engaged with is the DAC, the Drone Advisory Council, which is really represented by senior leadership of some of the major players in this UAS enterprise. And they meet, don't quote me on this, but I believe quarterly. And so that's a very important avenue. And even more recently, we've stood up at what we call the UAS safety team. For those of you that might be familiar with something called CAST, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, or GAJSC, the General Aviation Joint Safety Council. This consists of, the U.S. Safety Team is really open to anyone, but it's really a space where we pull the community together of operators to look at what's happening out there in the environment. For the FAA to fix things, it takes time, and sometimes things can be more easily fixed when the industry and the user community gets together and just adopts best practices or things on their own. That's what we've been using for CAST to improve commercial aviation safety. It's been extremely effective, and that's the approach we're taking now with this emerging UAS operations.
I think we may have time for one more question. You're right there.
Good morning. This is a question for John, actually, and it's kind of a two-part question. You mentioned earlier that you were collecting data and using it to inform your decisions, maybe make course corrections or that sort of thing. And I wondered if you can give us an example of something that you've learned. And then the second part of the question is, are you involved with, your community in sharing that information?
So, yeah, I mean, just as part of R&D, I mean, look, you use a visual technique to record data, and now you understand, I've got all these images, but they're just images at the moment. You have to progress to what do I make a decision about. So what we've been looking at is algorithms that automatically grade. They take expert opinion, automatically grade the images, and then you can look at large structures and you get a ranked report. So you know which areas to go address first. So it changes the decision process. So now instead of sending people out to look at 5,000 areas, I still know I need to look at 5,000 areas, but I know which are the first 25, which are the most critical, so to rank. In terms of sharing, personally, I don't see this as a competitive advantage space. So in my R&D portfolio, I've worked very hard to leverage with other partners to work as joint collaboration. And we share a lot of data. Our industry leaders, the American Petroleum Institute, have formed a committee that allows us to start to share together. The Pipeline Research Council International, which I'm very heavily involved with. We've done a lot of joint industry programs there. We share that immediately with all 32 operator pipeline members of there. So yeah, we are doing as much as we want. API have a panel in January in Galveston on this topic. I go to Europe. We've discussed a lot. We've brought things from Europe that they're a little bit more advanced in than maybe North America has been. So yeah, there is wide sharing here. In the environmental space, there's a massive amount of sharing going on. The Petroleum Environment Research Forum has shared a lot of data. So there is, but again, technology is moving fast, and there are also a lot of people in our industry. So I probably think I do a great job, but I probably only reach 5 or 10% of them right now, because they're busy with their jobs as well.
Help me thank Dexter Lewis from Southern Company, John O'Brien from Chevron, and Rob Pappas for FAA for this insightful panel on UASs, or UFOs.
Thank you.